It was around 9:30 p.m. on a Friday when I found myself at home. Earlier, my wife had called to let me know she'd be staying late at work, so when the phone rang again, I wasn't surprised. She said what she needed to, and I responded with a firm no. No, not just a simple no, but a firm, hell no. There was a diamond cab in the parking lot, number 127. I told her she had 30 minutes to get home. The drive from her office was only 25 minutes. If she didn't make it, I suggested she tell the driver to take her to her mother's house. She stayed quiet during my little outburst. All I could hear on the line was a deep sigh. I hung up, took the phone off the hook, and powered down my cell. Settling into my favorite chair, I tried to dive back into my book, but my mind wasn't in it. I couldn't focus. 29 and a half minutes later, I stood up, locked the front door, and attached the security chain. As I was doing this, a cab slowly pulled up. She stormed out of it, yelling something at the driver. I think she was saying something about walking faster than the cab was going. I gave the driver a $25 tip. We exchanged smiles, and he drove off. She rushed into the house, slammed the door, locked it, and added the chain herself. I sat on the porch in my rocking chair, pulling a beer from the cooler beside it. By the time I finished the beer, she still hadn't come outside, so I climbed into the cab of my work truck, switched on the CD player, locked the doors, reclined the seat, and cracked the windows to let the moisture escape. Let me introduce myself. I'm George Rout, though the Jeeb is silent, so my friends call me Grow. My wife, Terry, doesn't like anyone calling her Trout, though I think it's funny. She's a secretary, and I'm a master plumber. The next morning, Terry found me asleep in the truck. She claimed she had been looking for me for about 45 minutes. For some reason, she was still in the same clothes she had worn the night before. I suspect it had something to do with the fact that our bedroom door had been locked and she couldn't get in to change. Of course, it might also be because all her clothes were packed in trash bags, locked in the back of my truck. I listened to her rant for a while. Then, seeing the smirk on my face, she stopped. I asked if she'd finally gotten over her embarrassment. She started to respond, but quickly realized that a few neighbors were watching, curious about the scene. I grinned, walked over to the fridge for another beer, then opted for a Diet Coke. No need to slow down my brain cells. As I sipped the soda, the song Flower of Scotland came on. I cranked it up. I loved the sound of bagpipes. Terry went back inside, leaving the door wide open behind her. When the song ended, I followed her in and closed the door, ignoring her as she sat on one end of the couch. I made my way to the kitchen, where I had left a bag of donuts the night before. She hated donuts. I took a seat at the table, waiting for her to come in and eat a couple of them. When she finally walked in, I offered her one. If looks could kill, I'd be a goner. She sat in silence, glaring at me. I watched her, smirking with my head tilted. My dog would have been proud of me. I had nailed it. Finally, she spoke up. How did you know where I was last night? You told me, I answered. The expression on her face was priceless. I hadn't actually said a word about it, though. Would you believe that you were talking in your sleep? I know it was your fourth meeting with James. The first time, you just held hands. The second time, you let him play with your leg a bit. The last time, you made out with him for over 12 minutes in the parking lot before heading home. Want me to tell you more? Her face went pale. I still don't know why I did that, and I have no idea why I even called him, asking if I could spend the night with him, she muttered. Is that really what you wanted? I asked, because if so, you can file for divorce and enjoy the ride. At the time, I thought I wanted it, but now, looking back, I can't figure out why I felt that way. What I do know is that I love her too much to follow through with that. You know I don't want a divorce, she said. We continued talking for about another hour. She kept telling me how she had no idea why she had gone on those dates, and that she loved me, wanted to stay married to me forever. I told her that while I still loved her, the trust between us had been shattered, and it would take time for me to even begin trusting again. She asked if I would let her into the bedroom to take a bath and change her clothes. I asked, "Where did you sleep last night?" "In the guest room," she answered. I responded, "I'm going to open up the back of my truck. Remember that truck? That's where I slept. You can move your things from it and put them in the guest room. You'll be staying there for the foreseeable future." She looked at me as if I had just spoken a foreign language. "If my work truck isn't emptied out by Monday morning, I'll just drive to your mom's or drop it all off at Goodwill myself," I continued. "And don't make a mess in it," she protested. "I'm not sleeping in that room." "I'm your wife," I interrupted. "You're very close to being my ex-wife. You'll stay in the guest room. If not, when I go to open the truck, I'll drive straight to your mom's house, unload it in the middle of the yard, and then go inside to explain why it's all there. You'll have no say in it." By this point, my voice was raised not out of anger, but just for effect. The tears started flowing, but I didn't soften. "This is all a waste of time," I muttered, popping 2 more donuts in my mouth while I waited for her to calm down enough to speak again. Eventually, she asked again if I would unlock the truck so she could move her things. I sat in the front seat of the truck, staring at the locks, thinking about whether I should open them or not. Eventually, I decided to hold off. She noticed and said there was no need to install new locks. When she didn't come back right away, I locked the truck and headed to the backyard to check on Buttercup. Buttercup is my dog, half Mastiff, half Irish Wolfhound. To put it bluntly, he was massive and a bit rough around the edges. I'm no small guy either, standing at 6 feet 8 inches, but Buttercup made me look average. He was my baby, sweet as could be unless you mess with me, my house, or my truck. I had seen what he did to a guy who thought he needed my tools more than I did. The guy ended up begging the cops to take him away. His skin wasn't even scratched, but the worst thing my dog did was fart in the guy's face while sitting on him. He stayed there until I called him off, and the cops laughed at the crook before arresting him. Buttercup and I went to guard dog training together. He's trained to watch and wait until something leaves my truck, and once it does, he's quick to act. After a while, I heard the door slam, and Terry came outside. She started shouting, but then froze when she heard a low, menacing growl from behind her. Buttercup had positioned himself behind her and laid down at my feet, peacefully going to sleep. Terry, now cautious, asked me to unlock the truck so she could finish unloading it. I unlocked it while she brought in the first bag. I dumped the rest of her stuff onto the ground. "In 5 minutes, the sprinklers will turn on," I said. Terry rushed to grab her belongings, trying to prevent anyone else from taking them. She got to the second-to-last bag when the sprinklers kicked on. She grabbed the final bag, trying to make a run for it, but got drenched in the process. I smiled and gave Buttercup a stroke, satisfied with the small victory. Later, she was ironing her work clothes when her phone rang. I overheard her speaking loudly, apologizing for running out of the restaurant without saying goodbye. She claimed I had somehow figured everything out and told her to go home immediately. She told him it was a mistake and that they couldn't see each other anymore. I could hear his voice growing louder and more insistent on the other end. She told him goodbye and hung up, but he immediately called back. Terry turned her phone off. Now seemed like the right moment to explain a few things that we got married 6 years ago and spent our honeymoon attending a magic show. As part of the act, there was a hypnotist who picked Terry and 3 other women from the audience. He hypnotized them and made them perform all kinds of amusing actions. Afterward, he brought Terry back to me, and he whispered a special phrase that could trigger her to fall back under hypnosis whenever I wanted. When he finished, he woke her up and informed me that she wouldn't recall anything from the hypnosis session. However, when I used the special phrase, she would once again be under my control, with no one else able to influence her unless I allowed it. The first words out of her mouth when she came to were, "I told you, you can't hypnotize me." The audience erupted in laughter. That night, I tried the magic phrase on her again. This time, I told her that she would never allow anyone to touch her breasts or private areas without my explicit permission. Weeks later, I no longer had to rely on hypnosis to control her. I just had to remember that phrase, and the next time she called, my orders were carried out. I grew suspicious of her frequent late nights at work on Fridays, so I drugged her and questioned her about her activities. She openly shared everything with me. What she didn't know was that James worked as a salesman for a company owned by a friend of mine. His boss, Roger, had wanted to get rid of him for years due to his lazy work ethic. James had been inflating his expense reports for months, passing off dates as business expenses. No one could prove he was defrauding the company until he started dating Terry. Roger had been pushing for more evidence that the dinners with Terry were business-related. He needed contact details for the clients he was supposedly entertaining. If James failed to provide these, he'd be fired, and his expense reports would be rejected. The company had already reviewed the cell phone records, and with Terry's phone's GPS tracking her every move, I knew exactly where she went on her dates with James. The cab driver who took her around was my best friend Paul's son, who had met Terry at a wedding 6 years ago. He was now 19 and much more mature, sporting a beard. On Monday, James was called into Roger's office and given 24 hours to prove that his last expense report was legitimate. When he couldn't show that his dates were business-related, he was fired. James, being the hothead he was, didn't take the firing well. He was already furious about being dumped by Terry, whom he thought he had a chance with. I decided to keep an eye on her for a while to see how she was handling everything. Since I got off work an hour earlier than her, it wasn't difficult. I brought Buttercup along, my dog, who loved car rides. We just went for a drive and walked around the park. One evening, as she was leaving work, James grabbed her and forced her into his car. I was following behind to gather information. Terry, furious, fought back, scratching, punching, and kicking him until he struck her in the face. The blow knocked her unconscious. James drove south, heading for the only nearby hotel, the most run-down and disgusting one in town. I already had connections with friends at the hotels in the area, so I called Paul, who worked at one of them, and told him which car to follow. I stayed a safe distance behind them. When I saw them pull into a hotel parking lot, I parked my truck far away and walked toward the room. Buttercup was by my side. I knocked on the door, and one of James's friends opened it with the chain on. I kicked the door hard, knocking it open, and stormed into the room. Buttercup followed my lead, ready to protect Terry. James was standing at the foot of the bed, shirtless, but what I saw didn't impress me. My dog immediately went for James, targeting him between the legs. The two other men tried to get in my way, but I shoved them aside. As they struggled to get up, a scream echoed through the room, but I didn't stop. I seized both of my attackers' arms, twisting them back with force, dislocating their shoulders in the process. A series of strikes left both of them with fractured jaws, concussions, and gasping for air. I turned to see what else demanded my attention. The first man was unconscious beneath the door I'd torn off its hinges. James was sprawled on the floor, unconscious, shocked by the trauma to his lower body. Buttercup, my loyal dog, was happily chewing on his new toy. I ordered him to drop it, and the mutilated remnants fell to the floor. Terry was still passed out, tangled in her clothes, a mess, with her dress pulled up and underwear torn. I quickly draped a blanket over her as the wail of sirens grew louder in the distance. Buttercup and I moved to a corner of the room, away from the chaos. I commanded him to lie down, and he covered his eyes with his paws. He's a smart dog. When the police burst in, they saw me with my hands raised in surrender, Buttercup by my side. One of the officers had witnessed Buttercup's earlier attack on a man trying to steal my tools, and he could barely keep his composure as he laughed at the scene. I quickly explained, the woman on the bed is my wife. She was kidnapped earlier today, and I tracked them here. The mutilated genitals belong to the kidnapper. I don't know who the other three are. Someone reported the kidnapping, and the police have already begun searching for the car. Terry started to stir, panic rising as she was about to lash out at the first person who approached her. Buttercup, sensing her distress, rushed over in a few swift steps and sat beside her on the bed. She swung at him once before he gently licked her face, and after a moment, he let me approach. The officers, hearing a low growl from Buttercup, froze in place. I assured them she was fine, and he relaxed. When the ambulances arrived, they tended to Terry first. They tried to move James, but the bleeding was too severe, and he died before they could get him to the hospital. One of the paramedics stepped on a piece of flesh from the floor, and upon realizing what it was, immediately vomited. The two other men were taken next. The one trapped under the door wasn't too badly hurt, so they arrested him. The police lectured me on taking matters into my own hands, but they kept their distance from Buttercup. Neither I nor my dog faced any charges. Once everything settled, we headed home, so I could change before going to visit Terry in the hospital. Just as we arrived, the doorbell rang. It was the pizza I'd ordered for Buttercup, a small pie with extra cheese, beef, and green peppers. He was thrilled. At the hospital, Terry didn't have major injuries, just some sore muscles, a mild concussion, and a bruised jaw. As a precaution, she was held for 36 hours. The 3 men who were involved were charged with multiple felonies, 2 of whom fought back and sustained permanent injuries. Paul and I testified, as well as the police officers, and all 3 received prison sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. James was buried in his hometown, though his wife didn't attend the funeral. Buttercup was honored as an honorary state trooper for his bravery. Before that, Terry was terrified of him, so he wasn't allowed in the house. But over time, he earned his place. Now, he has his own room with a 4-poster bed. The only time he's separated from Terry is when I bring him to work with me. We found him a companion, an equally large and lovable dog, who is now expecting her first litter. Terry eventually recovered from her injuries, and years later, she was allowed back into our bedroom. We've had 6 children together, 4 boys and 2 girls. Fortunately, the boys all resemble me, and the girls take after Terry, though they both reach almost 6 feet tall. Buttercup lived to be 12, and his best friend, his companion, passed away shortly after him. She was never the same without him, thanks to careful breeding and training. We now have 4 of Buttercup's grandchildren and his son living with us. They're just as big and just as gentle as their grandfather. We named them Tiny and Baby, the boys, and Minnie and Petunia, the girls. The other dogs we work with all have puppies of their own, and they're all trained to ride in our trucks as guard dogs. Each of our trucks proudly displays a picture of Buttercup. We renamed our company to Best Friend Plumbing, and business is booming. Terry and I remain best friends, still deeply in love, and we're looking forward to growing old together. I still keep the lock sets in the garage, and she knows exactly where they are.